My wife doesn't come with me to church. Not because she doesn't like you or anything, but she's 76 years old. She's a year older than I am. And she says, I can't get up that early. You leave at 7:15. So my daughter takes her to the church where I belong in Oakmont on most Sundays, and she gets a ride home. Then the last thing she said to me last night before bed was, don't forget to bring a copy of your sermon home so I can read it Sunday afternoon. She said that last night. And when she doesn't come with me when I preach, she always wants to read the sermon. But in 50 years, I have never let her read the manuscript before it's preached. And the reason for that is that she was an English teacher. And I just have this vision of her going through with that red pencil, all the mistakes and the, contrary, all that kind of stuff that English teachers write. Well, last week she read the sermon, and we were sitting at the dining room table, and she read it and she finished it, and she looked up and she said, "You're preaching the same sermon every Sunday." Well, I said, "Yeah, I guess I am. Ever since we got into Epiphany. Same sermon. If you've been listening, you may catch that. The Magi follow the light to the manger, and then the light gets into Simon Peter and Nathaniel and Philip, and they become disciples. And then the light gets to a wedding party. It's doomed because there's no wine, but because the light is there, the water is changed into wine, and it's overflowing joy. It's the same sermon every week. It'll change, don't worry. And we're going to have Lent 2 weeks early in February, but that's okay. You'll see that there will be a change. But this is John's story. This is what John is all about. He's all about Epiphany. He's all about helping us see this light that has come into the world, this marvelous light. And this light wants to glow and wants to grow and wants to get into people and wants to spread and wants to go everywhere and every place, renewing and blessing the entire creation. And so, the same sermon today. It's the same one, but it's the one about the woman, the Samaritan woman, who comes to the well. Now, this story only appears once every 3 years in the lectionary, which makes me wonder, if I had been on the committee that was picking out what scriptures are going to fall in what Sundays, there are some that come every year. There are some scriptures in the lectionary. Every year you get them. But this one you have to wait 3 years to get. And I would have raised my hand. I said, wait a minute, folks. This is John's masterpiece. This is the longest conversation that Jesus has in the entire New Testament. He's talking more and sharing more with this woman at the well than he does with the disciples, than he does with any of the Pharisees or the Sadducees or anybody else. It's the biggest thing that John gives us. Don't you think we ought to have it once a year? But we get it today. The story of the woman at the well. John's masterpiece. Now, it starts out with Jesus and the disciples down in Judea, where John the Baptist is baptizing, and then Jesus' disciples are baptizing, and Jesus hears that there's something confusing going on between people don't know the difference between John and Jesus. So it says that he had to go back home to Galilee. He had to. Now, there are two ways of getting from the south. You know, in Jesus' day, there was Galilee in the south, and there was Judea in the south, and Galilee in the north, both Jewish. But there was a problem with getting from one to the other, because in the middle was Samaria. So most good Jews, if they could do it, would take the Jordan River Valley Road north, and it's 120 miles. But there's a shortcut. If you're willing to do it, you can make a straight run from Judea in the south to Galilee in the north and go through Samaria. Not everybody wanted to do that. Sometimes people might get beaten up. It happened. And those Samaritans are dirty. We don't want anything to do with Samaritans. Dirty people. You know, these Jews were so wrapped up in being pure. They were always worried about if we don't have the food, the hands washed and the food just kosher, if we get too close to someone who's sinful, if we break all of these rules, we're going to become unclean. And we'll have to go through all these rites of purification. They didn't like to go through Samaria. Dirty people. They might touch one or see one, or something might happen. You know, they would get unclean. You know, when I'm reading the Gospels, the one thing that appears to me that seems to be true for me is that Jesus didn't give a hoot about getting next to people who were unclean. I think it's because, as John says later in his gospel, Jesus knew, when he took the towel to wash the disciples' feet, it says, Jesus knew that he came from God and that he was going to God. That's all he needed to know. He didn't give a hoot whether he got close to people who were sick and unclean and outcasts and marginalized. He wasn't worried at all that he might be contaminated. He had to go through Samaria. So we know it wasn't because the bridge was out on the Swickley Road. And it wasn't because there was a bridge under construction. What does it mean when it says he had to go through Samaria? Every once in a while people will ask me the question. They'll say, Tom, why did you go into the ministry? And I cook up some story, or it's always a different story. Oh, well, I went to church camp one time and all. Try to solve a complex question with a simple answer. Tom, why did you go into the ministry? Well, I'll tell you why. I had to. You understand? I had to. And I think that's what the writer John was saying here when he said Jesus had to go through Samaria. There was a calling, there was a spirit that was leading that made him take the straight route north and go to Galilee through Samaria. It's not an easy walk. Some of you wouldn't want to even try it. I mean, it's hilly. It's tough walking. And the weather is really severe most of the year. It's very hot. No wonder, the gospel writer says, John says, that when they get to the well in Sychar, which is about 40 miles over the hills, through the rocks, in the heat, I'm sure it must have taken them a couple days, maybe 3, to make that 40 miles, that first part of the leg. It says that Jesus was tired. And he sat down. While the disciples went into town to get some food, he was tired. And he was hot. And he was thirsty. And it was noon. I've shared with you, a couple of you anyway, that I'm not usually around in the wintertime. I've got a shack down in South Texas, and I kid you not, the temperature there today is 81 degrees at my shack in South Texas, my golf shack, where I go to play golf for 3 months. 81. Last winter was the hottest we ever had. We ran our air conditioner almost all of March. And I've talked to the locals on several occasions, and I would say to them, it's hot now. How on earth do you live through a summer? And it's always the same answer. We go out early in the morning, we go out in the evening, and in the middle of the day, we stay home. It's the middle of the day, it's 12 o'clock, and nobody's out. Everybody's home in Sychar. But wait a minute. Here's a woman. What is she doing? Who is she? What a strange time of day for someone to be out in the middle of the sun. She's carrying a rope and she's carrying a pail. And the sermons that we've heard, and maybe I've preached, I don't know, I'm sure I did this. I think I probably had it wrong. We want to make her out to be a really bad person. She's there because she's the fallen woman of the community. She's by herself. She doesn't want to be seen. She doesn't want to be talked about. She doesn't want to be noticed. She wants to come there by herself and take water and get back home while nobody else is out. And so most of the sermons, I guess I've heard, and maybe, I don't know, maybe I've even preached, we want to dress her up as being a real floozy, you know. The higher the skirt, the redder the lipstick, the darker the mascara. We want to dress her up as really being a woman who is unclean. But at a closer look at the text, it doesn't tell us that. It doesn't invite us to pile on. You know, that's a real temptation, isn't it? It's a real temptation. To take notice of someone in the community or wherever who's made a big mistake, who's made some kind of mess of their life. It's a human thing for us to want to do it. We pile on. The worse we make them look, right? The better we seem to appear to ourselves. We don't know anything about this woman. We don't know anything about her. I remember one cold winter day when I was pastor in Rochester. Got a telephone call. I got them all the time, and somebody just said, "We don't have a thing in the house to eat. Can you help us?" Well, we kept a little bit of food around the church just because, you know, that might happen on occasion. It happened a lot, actually. I hung up the phone. I grabbed together a couple bags of groceries, put them in my car, and I drove into the center city. And I went upstairs to an apartment. I knocked on the door. The woman opened the door and let me in. It was a bare bones apartment. I can remember that there weren't any pictures on the wall. There wasn't any decorations. There wasn't any family portraits on the table. There wasn't a piano. Might have been a TV. I don't remember. I can remember looking out the window, and I can remember seeing a man on the ground being kicked by a larger man, severely kicked over and over again. He was rolling on the ground, and the man was kicking him. A drug deal? Gone bad? I don't know. Turned to the woman, and I offered her the groceries. We may have said a prayer. I can't recall. Several kids. Runny noses, crying, running around, diapers falling off. All these kids. I remember thinking, I don't know anything about this person. I don't know her story. I don't know how many men forced themselves on her in this neighborhood where it's difficult even to walk out your door without seeing violence. I don't know how she got those kids. How many men took advantage of her. I walked out thinking, I know nothing about this woman's life, her broken pieces, and what she has to do every day just to live. This woman comes to the well, and don't pile on. Don't pile on. You know how a woman could be divorced in those days? A man just sends her out into the world. She had 5 husbands. We don't know what happened. But we do know that if a man wanted to get rid of his wife, all he had to do was just send her out of the door, and he could use an excuse as stupid as he doesn't like her looks anymore. Goodbye. She gains 10 pounds in the wrong places. Well, there's better stuff around the village. Out you go. She had 5 husbands. Don't pile on. You don't know her story. And the man she was living with was not her husband. Well, you see, a woman living in that culture at that time couldn't go out and get a job. How would she feed herself? How would she protect herself? How would she make it through the day unless somewhere there was a man who could give her help? You don't know what she had to do in order just to eat, avoid malnutrition, and maybe even starvation. Don't pile on. Jesus didn't. He didn't feel contaminated by talking with her. He didn't feel as if he had to worry about drinking from the same cup that she touched. He wasn't concerned that this person who is outside of the covenant of Israel, thought to be unclean and impure, an outcast, a foreigner by everyone in Israel, the Samaritan. He wasn't worried a bit about who she was or what she was. And he began a conversation. And I hear the words again, and hear them as not as piling on, not as judgment, not as trying to shame her, when he says, you have had 5 husbands, and the one you are living with now is not your husband. Hear it as, I understand. I understand. And he offers her living water. She runs, according to one of the translations, not the one we read today. The CEV puts it that she runs back to town. I think she did. And she says, and I don't think it's in a normal voice, I think she shouts. I think it's an excitement that they've never heard from this woman, not expecting her to even appear in their midst. Come and see someone who told me everything about myself. Could he be the Christ? They must have seen a change in her. She knew her life would never be the same. She was already experiencing this gift, this living water that we yearn for. The living water that fills up the emptiness. The living water that heals the broken pieces. The living water that gives us strength and peace. She had tasted it for herself. And she goes back to the people who had scorned her and rejected her and gossiped about her and made her feel like she was the lowest thing on planet Earth. She goes back to them and invites them to have some living water. She was an unlikely missionary, wasn't she? She was a missionary to the first group of people that heard and received the gospel outside of Israel. The first. And today we've come to church to know again, to realize again, to affirm again that the most important thing in our lives, nothing else comes close. The most important thing of our lives is to open ourselves to the gift of living waters that can fill us and bless us and renew us and make us whole. The light. You see what's happened? Same sermon, different illustrations. You see what happened? It led the Magi to the manger. It got into Philip and Simon Peter and Andrew. It showed up at a wedding. And now it's breaking into a whole new group of people that once were outside of grace, outside of God's pleasure. And they're receiving it with joy and becoming believers of the first Samaritan Presbyterian church. Was founded that day. On the day I was ordained, the night I was ordained, a man stood up to sing a song I had never heard before. It's funny how through the years, 50 years later, every once in a while I sing it to myself. I pray it to myself. Maybe you've heard it. It goes like this. Fill my cup, Lord. Fill it up. Come and quench this thirsting of my soul. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Fill my cup. Fill it up. And make me whole. Amen.